A homily for the sixth Sunday of Easter. We invaded Iraq in 2003, and we found no weapons of mass destruction. Sometime later, a black pastor announced that he had discovered weapons of mass destruction in this country: poverty, racism, unemployment, and so on. This morning, I would like to announce that I have identified the weapons of mass destruction that are eroding our culture, our politics, and our church. My discovery came as I read accounts of the 18-year-old white man who shot 10 people in a black neighborhood in Buffalo last week. Several days later, the Washington Post carried an article by 2 university professors who have studied mass shootings. They said that hatred, racism, and so on are not the primary motive in most of these shootings. In fact, in at least half the cases, the motive remains unknown. The university professors report that shooters, who are overwhelmingly male, white in only half the cases, and on average 33 years old, nearly all come from dysfunctional families where they were abused in childhood, then bullied in school, and later were or thought they were mistreated in the workplace. In their anger and loneliness, they discovered other angry young men on the internet, and in those interactions found an enemy to blame: black people, Asian women, Muslims, and so on. In their newfound hatred, they laid meticulous plans for a shooting that would counter their imposed anonymity and compensate them for their suffering. So, the weapons of mass destruction seem to me to be exclusion, repression, and scorn, beginning with childhood trauma and continuing through the school and early work years. They were excluded from nurturing family and peers, forced to repress their hurt, and scorned into isolation. Our readings throughout the Easter season tell of God's love for us all through the risen Jesus, a healing love that helps us not be afraid. In the face of exclusion, repression, and scorn, it's easy to dismiss this divine call as naive and childish. But considering the world we live in, is there any alternative? And if so, how do we get from here to there? We might start by realizing that exclusion, repression, and scorn are also destroying our civic and church cultures. Inhabitants of these cultures think they can solve the challenges of immigration at home: radical Islam abroad, abortion, the Latin Mass, communion for political figures, coastal elites, and many others, by excluding and repressing one group, to leave their own group standing as a white evangelical nation, a smaller, purer church, or coastal elites become national. David Brooks's op-ed piece in the May 20th issue of the New York Times tells us that the country, and I might add the church, need to reunite liberal citizens and progressive Catholics with conservative citizens and conservative Catholics to hold in balance the 2 basic needs of any nation, culture, or church. The first need is for that which is beyond the human and more than the individual, namely the transcendent that establishes values and standards of conduct. The family is the social institution that nurtures, and healthy institutions that govern offer workplaces, and so on. The second need is the human need for a social and moral atmosphere in which individual identity, giftedness, ingenuity, and creativity can thrive, and can thrive in ways that may challenge the norm, even oppose the norm, and perhaps transcend the norm to reveal new ways of understanding, believing, and living. At present, Brooks says, the liberal and conservative movements have each taken on one of these two human needs and scorned the other side for its many hypocrisies. In doing so, both sides miss Brooks's central point. These two dynamics of human life are two dimensions of a single reality, not two separate realities, much less two realities that can be divided, its opponents excluded, repressed, and scorned. The hardest part of the exercise Brooks proposes is each side recognizing the weaknesses of their own positions in a spirit of humility and honesty. The desire among more progressive people to advocate for the flourishing of the human person makes accepting constraints of family and culture, of morality and religion uncomfortable, especially in light of the failures of family and religious and civil institutions. That said, we are already seeing the needs for such constraints as we observe what too much freedom looks like. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex do not represent the ideal family. Unlimited sex is not freedom. What could hundreds of Georgetown University seniors have been thinking when they trashed the Lincoln Memorial yesterday? And we are seeing too little freedom and too little generosity. Serving the poor is not socialism. Just obeying rules is not loving. Better gay and lesbian parents who love their children than heterosexual parents who do not. And worst of all, for our culture, our country, and our church, are the election deniers and Vatican II deniers who would exclude, repress, and scorn all of us to gain authoritarian control of culture, church, and country. Be sure to read Thomas Friedman's article in this morning's New York Times. The challenge we face is complex, and we need the humility of the tax collector in the parable with the Pharisee, the clear-sightedness of eyes from which the beams have been removed, and a Savior to move us beyond the shipwreck of dysfunctional families and excluded, repressed, and scorned individuals and racial and ethnic groups. This painful analysis will lead us to the conclusion that Jesus is right. Love is the only answer. Offer the tender virtues. Follow the lead of Father Greg Boyle, who asks us to cultivate a movement whose ventilating force is an extravagant tenderness. The disciples' way was a loving way of life, that had become the air they breathed, anchored in contemplation and dedicated to kinship as its goal. God's grace pours out on us today in this Eucharist and offers us extravagant love, enough for us and enough to share. Let's take up the challenge and share this love with all. It is our only hope. Love is all there is.